This is the Requiem Metal Podcast, episode 26, Darkthrone. This episode brought to you by Peaceville Records. Coming October 28th, Darkthrone, Dark Thrones and Black Flags, and Bloodbath, the Fathomless Mastery. Visit peacevillerecords.com for more information.
Lifeless,
Welcome to the Requiem Metal Podcast. You just heard Lifeless from Darkthrone, our band of the evening. I'm Mark Rudolph.
I'm Jason Hundy. And Lifeless, kind of, as when I was living with Brian Allen, a former Eclipse editor, writer, and he was a big kind of proponent of this song. And so I remember the three of us kind of, the whip cracking and stuff.
It's almost as good as, the Satyricon song starts out with the Gladiator quote, on my command, unleash hell.
Yeah.
It's like, sets a tone for the record.
It's a great opener to Requiem Metal Podcast, and it's from one of their kind of mid-era records, Ravishing,
from
Grimness.
99.
Yeah. And not that the song itself is like representative of anything like totally unique about Darkthrone, but just like kind of a, I don't know, to me it sounds like if you were going to play like a Darkthrone song that represented like the kind of all the elements that they kind of had, like it's kind of the average.
It's the most song. Accessible, if you can call any Darkthrone stuff that. But
so tonight we're going to be looking at Darkthrone, which is one of the more notorious black metal bands, I'd say, in kind of the whole history of the genre.
Yeah, I mean, one of the, as far as longevity goes, I mean, it's been the two guys, Fenriz and Nocturnal Culto since the beginning,
91.
Yeah, and they were in the background for a lot of the the crazy church burning crap and murders and all that stuff that if you want to read about, go check out what is that book called?
Lords of Chaos.
Lords of Chaos. Yeah, it chronicles that more than we could ever get into it.
And there's some of the fascist associations and things like that, which
have been dispelled to some degree.
Exactly.
It was just, I mean, you look at people that age and that, I mean, the whole second wave of black metal stuff that kind of started up with this, and wasn't there some like Hungarian band that apparently did something before that?
Tormentor? Or
it might have been. There was another one that was kind of credited as being like one of the first waves of the second generation of black metal, because the first couple Mayhem 7-inch releases, it was just
Bathory and some of that kind of stuff too. Was kind of the first wave, almost going back, if you want, to like Venom's black metal. I mean, that's kind of like the beginning of that kind of style of, I don't know, lyrics and then some of the kind of like harsher, almost kind of like biker, riffing, kind of power chording kind of stuff. But and then Celtic Frost, you throw them in there, and then certainly Bathory's where like the the real elements start to come together. But I think it kind of ends in the early 90s or like 89, 90 with like some of the stuff Mayhem's doing with Live at Leipzig and the
De Mysterious Dom Satanas.
Well, that comes out later, but I'm trying to think what came, the Death Crush EP and some of that kind of stuff, So really
total effing Armageddon and
yeah. And I think some of the songs Carnage, one of the songs we played a few weeks back on the
Projection
of Stained Mind compilation. So, they were really the only kind of like big Norwegian kind of black metal band at the time was Mayhem. And then it's almost like, Darkthrone kind of came out and became the progenitors of like this new sort of sound and style, and they essentially set the bar for like everyone else in the whole scene.
Well, and the interesting thing too is they started out as almost a peer with the Swedish death metal crowd. With their first record, we're going to play a couple tracks off of Soulside Journey. It's got elements of like that weird eerie melody kind of stuff, like the really progressive kind of stuff like At the Gates was doing at the time. And
like the Red in the Sky Is Ours kind of stuff.
Yeah, but yet mixed with the kind of production values of like a Left Hand Path, that kind of warmth.
Well, Thomas Skogsberg, produced it,
exactly.
And he's sort of given credit with kind of helping invent the whole kind of Stockholm Swedish metal, like death metal sound.
And I think a lot of people that are, maybe not be huge Darkthrone fans might not be even aware that Soulside Journey is a straight up Swedish death metal record, even though these guys are Norwegian. But
I mean, I love Soulside Journey. It's sort of strange, and maybe it's because like guys like Mark and I really don't abide by like the cult elitist sort of black metal kind of thing that kind of exists out there.
And I think if you don't have a sense of humor about this stuff, then there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, I mean, if you're taking it all to that seriously, I mean, Darkthrone, the guys from Gorgoroth,
I can understand the guy's. He's got his issues, but he's steadfast beyond his beliefs, and that's cool. But I think that's all you need. You don't need any more guys like that.
Yeah.
We've had enough of the sensationalism of all this crap happening. So
and Fenriz was certainly, he'll be the first to tell you, like, he
was just an angry guy and he didn't know why.
Yeah, and especially some of the National Socialist stuff that they kind of got in trouble with, like later on with Transylvanian Hunger and Panzerfaust.
And they're kind of in league with dude from Burzum.
Yeah, well,
from Grishnak.
Grishnak, wrote some lyrics for some of their albums and stuff, and certainly that added a end of controversy to them. And we'll talk a little bit more about how aesthetically they almost decided to like kind of stop doing interviews and stop kind of adding a mysteriousness to themselves, and that kind
of, it's a good marketing ploy.
It did, but it ultimately, unfortunately, what it did is it kind of allowed the rumor mill stuff to spread, because they weren't doing interviews to dispel any of the rumors. And so like it allowed that stuff to perpetuate way too far. And
actually on a lot of the reissues they have interview segments with the two of them, and they actually talk quite a bit about all this stuff, and you can find them on YouTube. You just go in there and look up Darkthrone interviews. I'm sure you can find them. But it's interesting that a band that had this kind of like technical ability on Soulside Journey stripped it all down with under their own accord to get this new black metal aesthetic that kind of, I'm not sure exactly what, I don't remember the reasons why they changed. If it was more of a nationalism thing to fit in the scene, to break away from the Swedish death metal scene at that point was considered by some it was too commercial, if you can believe that or not. So it's,
I mean, I from what I remember reading about Fenriz, he was really kind of leaning into a lot of the older like German thrash stuff, like the Destruction Creator. I mean, he was starting to hear that there was a really big kind of difference in terms of like the lyrics that were going on that. And then he discovered, I think I remember him saying he discovered a tape of Tormentor,
the Hungarian
band,
yeah.
Not the pre-Creator Tormentor.
Which Attila from Creator went on to sing on.
Or Attila from Tormentor.
Attila from, Milla from Creator, Attila from Tormentor.
But yeah, Attila went on and sang for
Mayhem for the one record.
De Mysterious.
Or two records. I think he came back later on to do something else.
Yeah, recently. I think he's come back or something like that, which I'm not very interested in anything Mayhem's done lately, so I don't know. I apologize, black metal fans. I've probably broken one of the 10 commandments of black metal there, but
I think the interesting thing about you can go for the trueness that you've got to be as harsh and as grim as possible or whatever with the production values, but they still manage to keep melody in there a lot. And the only way I can describe the experience is it's really immersive. And as soon as you hear a couple notes off of Blaze, like just the opening of Catherian Life Code.
Oh yeah,
it's like you just open this crypt and evil's coming out or something.
It's pure evil, and we'll talk a little bit later too about some of our thoughts about Transylvanian Hunger. And I mean, there's definitely an aesthetic to that song and that record, that's really quite fascinating. But
in 1992, the mind of a 17-year-old hearing this stuff, and me and the every once in a while contributor on the
Chris.
When we first heard it, we were just like, wow.
Yeah. It definitely very depressing. It really kind of knocks the life out of you, because really when you listen to like death metal, there's a certain kind of like energy and upbeatness to it, even though like it's dark lyrically or dark musically, but like there's something like kind of groovy about like the Stockholm metal or a lot of the Florida metal stuff.
There even is to this to some degree, but it's almost like you're being like it's like waves are getting over your head and you're just like almost drowning.
Yeah, you're being dragged into like a darkness of sort of a mentality that like kind of gets you into a mood of sorts. And I mean,
and it's similar to what Immortal does with evoking they're like the soundtrack of winter, kind of thing.
And I would fit these guys, like especially the sounds that we'll hear like after we get past Soulside Journey and like with a Blaze and Under a Funeral Moon and some of that stuff. If and even really Transylvanian Hunger to some extent kind of fits into like the same kind of mood setting that like Ulver was really good at doing in terms of like really uncomfortableness and really kind of like even if they were playing something soft, there's a couple moments where like they lighten the sound like on a Blaze or something like that. It's still uncomfortable. And
when
it's still
they let
like
it breathe, there's still like that razor buzz behind it.
Yeah, there's something just not happening. And like whereas Satyricon started off with a lot of like atmosphere and keyboards and things like that, which we did, a month and a half ago. We did a Satyricon podcast. Darkthrone's more like just sort of like focused on like that darkness. They're not willing to like kind of add some commercialism or kind of catchiness, at least in their early part of their career. They will a little years later, like you just heard with Lifeless, where there's like a lot of Motorhead, Bathory kind of riffing going on. But
I think with Blaze the Northern Sky and then we go to Under a Funeral Moon, and then finally to kind of the peak with Transylvanian Hunger. It's a slow down. It's like trying to forget all this musicality.
It's the degradation of like it's like the deconstruction of like everything they create with Soulside Journey.
Yeah.
You're watching it really like almost rot and melt away into like this musical like primordial pool
evil.
Of like exactly. And that's really saying something. Burzum certainly was able to do that in a couple of their early stuff in terms of just that you hear it and you're just like, ugh, Like
it sounds like it's war, it's inner turmoil. It just really interesting sounds. But then after Transylvanian Hunger, they kind of slowly progress back up. They start getting a little tongue-in-cheek. They get some more punk roots coming in there.
The crust stuff that starts popping in. But yeah, and so like again, I guess as someone who is unfamiliar with the black metal scene, or maybe unfamiliar with Darkthrone, and maybe you like your metal well produced, sure, let's say, or you like it kind of to have a certain kind of warmth or something to it.
By these first 3 songs, you'll know if you want to listen to the rest of the podcast.
Yeah, and I hope I urge you, just even from a historical point of view, to not kind of like click off, because certainly, like, you know, the first time I encountered Darkthrone, and you said you and Chris encountered Darkthrone and this sort of music, I mean, it's curiously kind of upsetting in a way. Like, you're kind of uncomfortable with it, but yet you're kind of fascinated to it, and you know, work with it and kind of see where this band ends up, you know, because by the end of the podcast, they're going to end up way different than they did in this middle section, where it's very grim and very, you know, lifeless. Let's just say,
sure,
you know, just like
similar to like Immortal. When you first hear it the first couple times to an untrained ear, it sounds like a mess.
Yeah.
But the more you listen to it, you're hearing all these different lines of melody and just all these, like, this texturing of the music going through it.
Like when I heard Transylvanian Hunger the first time, like 15 years ago, like I was not interested in it. Like, no, you know, like give me an In Flames or Dark Tranquility record, you know, like I wasn't, and not to say I didn't like black metal, I did, but I was like more, I kind of like was more hooked into like Enslaved or Emperor, you know, something that was built around like songwriting and like musicality still.
Atmosphere.
Yeah, a lot of like, you know. So again, we're just, you know, when you're listening to this stuff, just be aware of that you kind of have to come into it with a little bit of an open mind, and, you know, be appreciative of the historical roots that this laid, the fact that this really creates essentially the blueprint for how to make a grim black metal record. I mean, it's been
copied a billion times.
Yeah, the how-to guide, and these are the guys who created it. You may have heard it done, maybe even done better in your eyes or your ears, I guess, you know, as a listener. But this is where it comes from, and this sort of historical nature to a podcast like this. And, you know, you might sit through, you know, 4 or 5 minutes of sort of like, you know, harshness in terms of musical listening.
Like at the barbershop getting your hair cut.
Yeah, something like that. But, you know, turn the volume down, and just kind of like work with it a little bit and kind of see where it takes you.
See, I don't know how much of a stretch this is, but I almost liken this stuff to some degree to like what Faust and John Cage did as far as mood setting. The stuff wasn't pleasant to listen to, but it evoked a reaction, and it will put you in a certain frame of mind. And I think this stuff definitely succeeds at that.
And really, like we talked about a couple weeks ago with Carcass, you know, like with the early stuff that, you know, John Peel hooked onto it because John Peel understood music enough to understand that this, even though it was like very deconstructive and very like almost anti-music, it was still making a new form of music that had never been created before. That's essentially, you know, Darkthrone's going to do here is take some of the elements that Bathory or Mayhem did and kind of like just drop the bass out, you know, turn up the gain, kill like a lot of the elements that make music fun to listen to. Yeah. And you know, it's like,
it is work
killing fun, you know, is like almost what Darkthrone was trying to do.
When I first heard the Darkthrone record, was just like hearing that first Swedish death metal record. You're just like, wow, there's all this now too, you know.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many more of these benchmarks that we really have left without really, you know, changing the genre, because at this point this is when production was king. And this was, you know, the kind of, there was the
it was almost their middle finger to like the trends, you know.
Was it Death Like Silence that had the whole thing that was like, you know, screw Morrisound Studios, like anti-trend,
anti-poser.
They're trying to pull away from all that stuff as well, which
the overproduced bass heavy kind of like warmth that they had, you know. But the songs we're going to open up with, you mentioned, you know, having these roots in Swedish death metal and At the Gates, but I think essentially we should also mention the fact that the first few Darkthrone records are on Peaceful. And there's really a peaceful sort of sound to this record as well, because another element you hear is kind of the doomy sort of stylings of like Paradise
Lost riffs on this off the first record.
Yeah, so if you've heard Darkthrone before but never gone back to hear Soulside Journey because maybe, and I don't know what the reputation of this record is to like the cult black metal people, if they just dismiss it as like, don't bother with it, don't listen to it, it's nothing like any of the other stuff, it's not even worth hearing. I'm telling you, this is a great record. And if there was a band different than Darkthrone that had their title on this would probably be considered like a early masterpiece of metal.
It's almost like the first Radiohead record is to the rest of their catalog. If you want to put in that kind of context.
It's a great record, but it doesn't sound like Radiohead.
It doesn't sound like it's like a pop record almost.
Yeah.
So.
And so Soulside Journey, hopefully, listen to it with open ears. Maybe like newer Darkthrone, and just give it a chance. So and hopefully you'll hear a lot of those kind of early Peaceful elements as well that you could hear like on a At the Gates record, Red in the Sky is Ours, or Paradise Lost Gothic, or any of the other kind of really strange lineups that Peaceful had at this time. I mean, My Dying Bride, Anathema. Just music that was made not to fit into any kind of trend, but just music that was made to be musical and like interesting.
In a sense, I see the early Peaceful releases is like it's like the art versions of stuff that's being put out on Earache.
Sure, and you can almost compare it to like
the avant-garde of metal at the time.
Yeah, or like early late 50s Blue Note Records jazz, or the certain eras of other kind of labels, almost like say 1987 to 1989 Earache was, with Altars of Madness and all these other, Scum and all these things, Rika Putrefaction and Symphonies and stuff. It was like this whole
compared
new
to the thrash industry or the thrash genre at that time. This stuff was totally like avant weirdness.
Absolutely. So, again, it's kind of interesting stuff, and we hope you enjoy it. So we're gonna kick into Cromlech and Neptune Towers from the Soulside Journey record, and we'll close this set out with their first foray into the black metal, grim black metal genre with A Blaze in the Northern Sky.
You just heard A Blaze in the Northern Sky, Neptune Towers, and Cromlech.
From Darkthrone, of course. And Blaze in the Northern Sky, I love the title. I mean, I really, now the song is about kind of like resistance to Christianity that's, came to Norway in the, 1,000 years prior to this, in the 900s and stuff. So, I don't know. I guess in retrospect, the song title, Blaze in the Northern Sky, coupled with the controversies of church burning that happened in Norway, there almost seems to be like a...
Well, even...
I mean, it's obvious the connection that you're seeing there with the Blaze in the Northern Sky, the fact that you're seeing these churches go up in flames, and it's this opposition to,
you could even
Norwegian
see
Christianity.
You could even see it as, all this false death metal stuff. This is the true stuff coming down from the north. It's going to obliterate everything else.
Yeah, I mean, it really lit the world on fire. I mean, black metal, to some extent, became more popular than anything that death metal had done at this point.
I remember there was that Rolling Stone article that had, Isan from Emperor, and, I mean, there's, a cover story with these guys, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think it was sort of kind of an off-cover story. It was in Spin Magazine.
Spin Magazine, Stone. Okay. But, I mean, it was a big deal. It was the first mainstreaming of death metal we really saw.
And
or extreme music.
Or extreme music, yeah. Or extreme metal. The first book to be written that was of any kind of importance was not written about death metal or grindcore. It was written about black metal because, again, there was a story there. There was, a controversy there. There was all these sort of the murders. I mean, all the stuff that you guys already probably know about.
And I think when people get bogged down in that as well, and I mean, sure, it's sensational or whatever, but there's a lot of validity to the music. I mean, it's gone down the tubes on a lot of stuff. People that are just picked up a Darkthrone record last year and are trying to reproduce that. It's what the hell's the point? But this stuff, I mean, it really captured an era. Even aesthetically, looking at these records, compared to the typical heavy metal cover that usually had, pretty rich, vivid imagery, this stuff is all black and white. There's no color in this stuff at all. It's just a black and white photo. Everything's black and white. We got to mention that Darkthrone, I think, probably has the best
coolest
logo ever.
One of the coolest logos, certainly the best black metal logo.
Yeah,
right up there with a Unleashed and some of that stuff. That's pretty awesome. But yeah, the photos, say it all. And at this point, on A Blaze in the Northern Sky, which is a kind of they're really their landmark record, I'd say. I mean, if you had to own one Darkthrone, this would probably be the one to get.
Sure.
In terms of historical impact and things like that. They're a 3-piece. It's Fenrez on drums and
Satan's Poet
as well, satanic poetry and haunting chants. So he's doing some kind of background vocals and things like that too. But he's mainly just the drummer and one of the primary songwriters and lyricists. Zephyrus.
I think he actually does the spoken word stuff that we just heard in Blazing Northern Sky.
Oh, does he? Okay. Zephyrus, is one of the guitar players, but the main kind of lead guitar player and vocalist, and I think he doesn't play bass on this record, but he plays bass on future records, is
almost everything after Under Funeral Moon, I think.
Yeah, Nocturnal Culto. Because at this point, the guy they brought in to do bass was the original bass player, right? What was his name?
Dag Nelson? Is that who it was?
Yeah, I think it was Dag Nelson.
Yeah.
And he was the guy, we were just looking at the old Decibel Hall of Fame, interview, and they basically were toying with this guy in the studio because, here he had done Soulside Journey, and then I think he left the
really
band.
Good stuff. I mean, really technical stuff on Soulside.
Really
too.
awesome
that
you just heard in some of that stuff, and you heard great guitar solos and all this dynamicism, and then I'm sure if you were listening to this, when it went from Neptune Towers to the way that a blaze jumps out at you, I mean, it grabs you by the throat and pummels you, it's harsh.
Culto.
Well, no, that we will hear in a second. It's cool stuff, and it razor sharp, lyrics, razor sharp sort of guitar sound. The drums are really sloppy, which if you heard the drums on the first two songs.
And I don't know. I think it's where they probably mic'd all the whole drum kit, and on this it's probably we've got one hanging for the cymbals and one for everything else. And I don't know if this is the first band to do it or not, but one aesthetic thing that you hear in a lot of this black metal is the thunderous drums that almost evoke thunder, lightning, atmospheric events.
The nature kind of heathenism.
Yeah, they're almost like explosions instead of drums where they have it's almost like they got a mic stuck right inside the floor tom or something. They explode out. I know Mayhem did that a lot in Emperor. I mean, that's kind of a consistent thing running through this style of music.
I think too, to also talk about this aesthetically is the return of corpse paint. You had seen Dead from Mayhem doing a lot of the corpse paint, and he was really the only one of the kind of original black metal scene. And here you've got 3 guys in the back and a guy, a haunting like ghost of a human being.
Sounds like he's flying in.
Yeah, I mean, he's like a demon sort of flying down with this sort of corpse paint on the cover with his mouth. I mean, it looks like a vampire swooping in almost. There's just something about the way this looks and feels, and the photos and the logo. I mean, everything about it is just crying that this is something like that the music scene has not heard before.
And I think they encapsulate it in every aspect of aesthetically, musically, imagery, everything.
And the song that we're going to hear next, In the Shadow of the Horns, which...
In the Shadow of the Horns.
Oh, is it of Horns? Oh, sorry, I wrote it wrong. In the Shadow of Horns.
Great title.
This, not only is it a great title, but there's so much happening in this song that, to me, this is the most essential, not only Darkthrone song, but it might be like one of the most essential black metal songs like ever, in terms of like...
So.
It has everything in it, fast. It has that slow, kind of grinding Celtic Frost Bathory guitar on it. I mean, he even calls out
Nocturnal Cult, the
introduction
summoning of him or whatever.
The summoning of him, and then of course in the middle, the war cry of Unholy Black Metal, which becomes now
when it goes into the blast beat. Yeah,
it becomes the war cry of all black metal. Unholy Black Metal, and they're going to put it like on the tag of the back of their records from now on. Darkthrone plays Unholy Black Metal exclusively and things like that. And it's so much of this. I feel like they're a group of guys in a studio, and they're creating all this, not knowing that they're like really laying the foundation for like a whole genre that hasn't really been explored yet.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was just turning their back on something that in their eyes had gotten kind of too big and lost direction or something. And in the act of just shrugging all this crap off, like they totally shot it up a new direction.
Yeah, and you'll still hear some, there's still elements within these Ablaze songs of some technicality still there. Some, I don't want to call them guitar solos, maybe some guitar flurries of sorts.
Yeah, there's bends and leads and stuff like that. But as we go up the discography list,
you're going to hear it more and more deconstructed. I think
guitar turns into an atmosphere, almost like a keyboard. I mean, just like a singular buzz.
And you're not going to hear bass. That's one of the big things, is like the bass is dropped out. And I was starting to tell this story earlier, but in the Decibel Hall of Fame, they brought in, was it Dag Nelson? Is that his name? Dag
Nelson.
They brought him in, and he came in with all his like fancy bass guitar equipment. I guess Nocturnal Cultural and Zephyrus like gave him like this really crappy like
little PV
amp, and basically said, "No, this is what you're playing on." And they just sort of ridiculed the poor guy. And of course, he left after that. Is this the last record with Zephyrus, or does he play? He plays on Under the Funeral Moon. Okay. I have no idea why he ends up leaving. Do you know?
Probably, I mean, because he seems like he's a pretty talented musician. He's probably being challenged.
Yeah,
he's like, why am I even here? It's like, why does Metallica have a bass player?
Yeah, exactly.
Except, on the new record you can hear it.
Yeah, but it's the same kind of thing. So, but let's get into some more stuff from Ablaze. We're going to hear In the Shadow of the Shadow of the Horns, the Pagan Winter, and then we're going to close things out with the title track from their third record, Under a Funeral Moon. But
just imagine Satan looming over you.
Yeah, exactly. And in particular on this opening track, this is the quintessential black metal song, and it's got all the elements for it, including some of the humorous elements I think Darkthrone's going to kind of come back to years later.
Yeah, even more so.
Yeah, for sure. Enjoy.
the 666 record has been achieved.
Yeah.
You just heard Under a Funeral Moon, The Pagan Winter, and In the Shadow of the Horns from Darkthrone's A Blaze in the Northern Sky and Under a Funeral Moon.
Yeah, and Under a Funeral Moon continues the aesthetic that you're gonna, that was established on A Blaze in the Northern Sky, but kind of takes it to like the next step in terms of really getting rid of all the elements of like any kind of musicality, essentially.
Yeah.
The drums are kind of played bad. There's no
traditional musicality.
Yeah, the guitars are really sort of, like you said, stripped down and stuff. Plus, you're seeing kind of a continuation of a theme on these records in terms of the photography and stuff, because now on the cover it's
Nocturnal Culto,
and he's kind of hiding behind a tree of sorts, like kind of looming in the shadows.
He's got an animal skull on a stick.
Yeah, and
scary.
Yeah, it's some creepy stuff, and they're really kind of adding the aesthetics of that. And I can't remember if they, it's not on this record that they say anything on the back. I can't remember which one where they start doing the unholy black metal. Is it Transylvanian Hunger?
I thought it was on A Blaze in the Northern Sky, wasn't it?
Oh, okay. Maybe it is. No, I don't see it.
Maybe it is Transylvanian.
It says Darkthrone is for all the evil in man. Yeah. So, anyways, they're going to kind of continue that trend. And on Transylvanian Hunger, the next record after Under the Funeral Moon, you're finally going to see a kind of black and white, grim photo of Fenris. So, it's kind of cool to give honor to all the members of the band. It's like a...
Oh, it's funny. Even if you just look at the photography, there's grayscale in the photography, and then we go to Transylvanian Hunger. It's high contrast black and white, and which echoes the harshness of this record too.
Sure.
But on a production standpoint, on Under a Funeral Moon, we didn't play the song Natasha in Eternal Sleep, but that almost sets the stage for how the production is going to eventually go, where they take out all midtones. It's all high end.
And I remember when we were in New York talking, New York and Philly, talking to Albert, and Albert was talking about like production and things like that, and like how
Albert Decibel Magazine.
Yeah, Albert from Decibel Magazine, and how production like fits what the record's supposed to be. He says in terms of like if there was ever like an award for the best production for a record, in terms of what the scope and vision of what that record wanted to be, he says Under a Funeral Moon would probably win. He says even though you listen to this and the last thing you think about is good production, it's made exactly the way they want it to.
It's made, the right way for that record, and it's not
kind of uncomfortably.
And it's not just somebody with lack of experience doing this. I'm sure this is a producer that knows what they're doing, trying to get this effect. It's like reverse engineering kind of stuff.
Yeah,
production.
It's really weird. Some people have talked about like, if you play like some certain extreme music for people, even like extreme jazz, like I feel like the same thing that kind of happens with like some of the free jazz stuff, where people just think, like Cecil Taylor, like, oh, this guy, what is he doing? He's just hitting notes. There's no rhyme or reason to what he's doing.
He's deconstructing.
He's deconstructing music, and this guy knows. He knows how you have to understand music in order to destroy it the right way. I mean, you got to know what you're doing to play it in order to like tear it apart.
Same with art. If you do abstract art outside of learning fundamentals, I think there's something inherently wrong. Picasso knew how to paint photorealistically before he goes and deconstructs objects.
Absolutely,
and I think that's important.
Jackson Pollock is painting like real forms and pictures before he gets into some drip paint style, and like that's why I feel with Darkthrone. If you can't listen to like those first two songs off Soulside Journey, understand these guys know how to play music. They're good musicians. The rest of this doesn't make sense. It just sounds like a bunch of guys in a garage trying to figure out music, and that's not what it is, And
I think the imagery is the thing that probably turns most people off, because if these were guys that were just, button-up shirts, looking fine, that did this kind of music, I think it'd be more accepted, and the lyrical value, all that kind of stuff. I think it's just as experimental as any kind of music is right now at all, or was at this time.
Sure. And you look at, like, just the photography, in terms of unsettlingness, Nocturnal Cultal, you mentioned has the animal skull or something like that. I mean, look at the back of Fenrez. He's sitting on the back. It looks like in a cemetery with a cross behind him, and he's shirtless in a bullet belt, and he's like,
it's like he's bathing in blood or something.
Yeah, or something, and he's holding like it looks like some sort of skull of some sort there.
Yeah.
I mean, he's like commiserating the dead. Like raising the dead. They knew what they were doing. This is good marketing. I mean, these guys,
Alice Cooper did in the 70s.
Yeah.
It's just taking it up to that extra level, and you don't know if they're dead serious or not.
And, Fenrir says, I was angry at the time. I was kind of like really into like the persona that we were kind of creating. He says, so this is why we stopped doing interviews, to just add mysteriousness to it. And like, I mean, they just...
It's no different than Manowar.
Yeah.
Manowar has this homoerotic... brothers in arms kind of barbarian motif. And these guys are just doing the opposite, and for some reason the other one's more acceptable.
Yeah, wow.
It's theatricality.
So. Absolutely. And I mean, Darkthrone, none of these guys were involved in any of the killings or church burnings or controversy. No. I mean,
nobody's ever jailed.
Yeah, they were just playing music.
Had some bad associations. But.
Yeah, that's true. And that gets us into talking about, the next things we're kind of going to hear here. We're going to hear some more stuff from Under a Funeral Moon. My favorite song from the record, which is Summer of the Diabolical Holocaust, which may or may not be the beginning of their troubles in terms of their associations with Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
I mean, Holocaust is a word that existed
it's
way
loaded
before
now. Yeah.
World War II, but again...
it's a sensitive word.
It's a great title, though. Yeah. Summer of a Diabolical...
Pure Holocaust, immortal.
Exactly.
Great title.
I mean, summer evokes like festivals and like playing in the sun. It's some diabolical like, oh, let's go to a celebration of the summer of the diabolical Holocaust. There's something kind of humorous about that. But so you're going to hear again some more of the kind of stripped down aesthetic that you heard with Under a Funeral Moon. But to me, this is the most dynamic song on the record. It kind of changes a little bit more than some of the other stuff on this.
The opener that we didn't play, I definitely recommend people going and seeking that out. That's just it pummels and it sets a stage for it. It's a great album opener.
And we'll have you know too that we had originally planned on a third song from Soulside Journey and a third song from Under a Funeral Moon, but the time constraints of podcasting really kind of took away from that.
Service, we could go for 2 hours, but listeners ramble.
It happens. And again, if you maybe it would be too much too. I mean, there's a.
We just wanted to kind of skim the surface. We got stuff from most of their records, at least
from the early era.
Yeah, early era, and then a little bit of this more contemporary stuff that we'll hear. But
And in terms of controversy, they've already sort of stirred the pot, but it's with this next record that you're going to hear couple of songs from after Summer of the Diabolical Holocaust, where they really kind of met their match in terms of like, oops, maybe we've kind of gone too far.
Yeah.
Half the lyrics are written by Varg Vikernes, however you pronounce that.
Vikernes, I'm not sure. The most notorious black metal scene member.
The most notorious musician in the whole world. Yeah.
Now he sells candy in prison.
Yeah, exactly. And you're not going to hear either song or any of the songs that he did write. We're going to play some of the ones that Fenrez wrote, but the other thing is on the back it had some associations with Aryan
nationalistic views.
Yeah, and
which you could take either way. It's more guilt by association than them being purveyors of this kind of thing. But
I think too, shock value plays into it too. I mean,
what kid wasn't somehow like morbidly drawn to Nazi imagery?
Yeah,
it's so iconic that that invokes certain things.
That's like accusing the History Channel of like being pro-Hitler. I mean, people. The reason they run program after program after program on Nazi Germany and Nazis and the occult and Hitler's drug problems, and I mean, isn't because they were trying to like promote Nazism. They're trying to like. It's what people are interested in. People are fascinated by that stuff.
There hasn't really been a figure in history that's echoed that kind of evil outside of Satan.
yeah, absolutely. And here for the first time, not only are you seeing that, but right across the back, true Norwegian black metal, and they're starting to create this stamp that like.
And I believe they're all sung in Norwegian, right?
Yeah. Yep. So
that's like a further, forget you to the rest of the community that's not involved in this.
It's creating this more elitist sort of attitude, that you not only can you not understand what we're saying, you can probably barely listen to this record, barely get through the sound or lack of sort of production that's there. A lot of things kind of happening, and if I'm not mistaken, is this the last? Yeah, this is the last Peaceful record they're going to do, and I wonder if because of the controversy that kind of ended some of their associations for a while with Peaceful, and
I think Peaceful has connotations to it itself when they move on the next record, Panzerfaust, to Moonfog, started by Satir von Graven of Satyricon.
Yeah,
I mean that's like further totally entrenched in that black metal community.
Yeah, because at this point Peaceful's probably they're doing all right. With some of the Anathema Bride stuff. They're becoming more of a mainstream metal label, and maybe Darkthrone felt that they're not cult enough for them.
Sure, I could see that.
So. But so we're going to hear Summer of Diabolical Holocaust, and then we're going to hear a couple samples of Transylvania. We're going to hear the beginning part of Transylvanian Hunger, and then another tune from the record called Skald, Satan's Soul, which you can figure out for yourself what that means, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But you in particular wanted to mention one thing about Transylvanian Hunger, the title track, in terms of what it evokes in you, in terms of being like
I don't remember now.
The loss of hope, kind of.
Oh yeah. I mean, totally. You hear that the first opening kind of it's bleak. It's like, okay, you're being sent to the gallows or something. It's a horribly. They just amp up that atmospheric, that feeling that they're trying to evoke through these records. It's just, loss of hope is like when you hear that. That's
it's definitely one of the more hopeless songs I've ever heard. One of the other things you'll start to hear is I was kind of noticing some kind of like overish, enslaved kind of like moments going on in some of this stuff, along with, of course, the Bathory, Celtic Frost, Venom.
Well, and they're almost holding out the riffs to the point of uncomfortableness, and just before it gets too much, they kind of change just slightly. But it's so subtle. This whole record's really subtle. Outside of Skald, Satan's Soul is the more dynamic record, but for an album,
you can call it dynamic. Dynamic in context.
If you look at a waveform of the sound, it's more dynamic than the opening track. But
and then we're going to close things out with Triumphant Gleam from Panzerfaust, but we'll talk about Panzerfaust when we come back. So enjoy Triumphant Gleam, Skald, Satan's Soul, Transylvanian Hunger, and then the opener, Summer of the Diabolical Holocaust.
You just heard Triumphant, Gleam, Skald, Satan's Soul, Transylvanian Hunger, and Summer of the Diabolical Holocaust.
And Triumphant Gleam was from Panzerfaust.
From Panzerfaust, which came out after Transylvanian Hunger, the following up to that, their first one on Moonfog.
And you're also now seeing the Unholy Black Metal tag.
The most hated band in the world tag. That's pretty good. That's almost like Fantastic Four, the world's best comic magazine.
Yeah, exactly.
But this record is kind of, I think it seems like aesthetic or musically, that's just kind of as far as you could go outside of recording on, a junk tape player and sending out like cassette tapes or something. So the bass started coming back slightly more into this next record, and with Triumphant Gleam, I'm sure anybody that's well versed in heavy metal will definitely hear some Celtic Frost threads throughout that song.
definitely a much more musical record than Transylvanian Hunger was. You know, it's kind of like I almost feel like they're kind of coming out of the dark again. Like they proved their point.
Yeah, they like.
Yeah,
I don't think
we won.
Hammer the nail in any further than that.
Maybe Oliver kind of came in close competition with Nathan's Magical to some extent. You know,
close.
Cutting their patch cords.
No, they did cut their patch cords. Just so they short out. So
but again, they won, and now they're kind of coming back with the next two records, Panzerfaust and then Total Death, which are both really pretty cool records, and they're two that I'm not that terribly familiar with because I never had them when I was younger, like you did.
Yeah, and with Total Death, it's that at the point it came out, it was 1996. That's when Emperor was kind of showing off a lot, showing like
Dimmu Borgir,
like what black metal could do if it veered off the the absolute opposite direction of these guys. And Total Death was kind of they brought a little bit of the whole Soulside journey tone back, not the musicianship or anything,
but the bass is back, and like
the bass is back, and there's like
music.
They're bringing a little bit more of the battery feel kind of into the thing, and the vocals aren't as harsh.
Yeah, and I hear a lot more like kind of older enslaved influence, where it was a little more epic or atmospheric in a way, less like
and even like the imagery on the cover, it's no longer photos of people. This is like
it's not demons and like demonic looking corpse paint people on these covers. They're like kind of naturey, kind of
Panzerfaust is like a silhouette of a guy sitting over with a torch in the woods, and then Total Death is kind of like almost like this.
It's like an amorphous cover, like Tales from a Thousand Lakes or something,
Yeah, really, it's just this desolate lake with the moon in prominent view, and the themes and stuff on this record seem to be a little bit different than just Earth's Last Picture, that the track that we're going to hear off this record is that just kind of colors different imagery than they've kind of used in the past. And the other track that we're going to play is fast forward 3-4 albums after actually we already heard something off Ravishing Grimness that came out after Total Death, but they did Plague Wielder in 2001, Hate Them in 2003, and Sardonic Wrath in 2004, which they're good records, but there's not a huge shift that's you need to necessarily hear some of the stuff. So, and I think the Too Old Too Cold is kind of like a nice retrospective song about these guys and their kind of place in the scene now too. So,
and certainly if you only had like sort of $15 and you wanted one Darkthrone record around the kind of the late 90s, early 2000s, they also put out the Preparing for War, which has songs from Soulside, Journey Ablaze, and Under the Funeral Moon, and Transylvanian Hunger. I think basically all their Peaceful stuff, along with some demos and things like that. So that's a really nice, kind of best of kind of compilation, if there was such a thing, But I think, the song we heard at the opening of the set, Lifeless, is really representative of the sort of beginning of this new era where they're going to play like a little bit more sort of sludgier, kind of
they're bringing in
things.
Motorhead. They're bringing in the punk aesthetic back.
The crust punk, like Motorhead, Bathory, sort of that like biker rock kind of riffing that Darkthrone's almost become associated with.
The title, The Cult Is Alive, it's like we're not going anywhere. And the next record that came out after that was FOAD, which is F Off and Die, basically. And the new one is it should be coming out probably by the time you're listening to this, is Dark Thrones and Black Flags.
And there's a really great thing in Ian Christie's Sounds of the Beast where, again, a lot of people have kind of accused Darkthrone of becoming kind of like the AC/DC of black metal with their last like 3 or 4 records, because it's essentially kind of the same thing over and over again, and it's so simplistic in their vision, and...
Well, you know what you're going to get. There's that kind of... thing going on.
Exactly. And one of the things he says, after years of Grim Faces, Fenris kind of began to kind of get like more comedic and stuff like that. There's a real sense of humor and tongue-in-cheek stuff. And he says, we're not entertainers, we're a black metal band. And he says there are limits to how much technical Neil Peart drumming there's supposed to be on an album like Bathory's The Return. He says, I'm really happy about my drum sound. It's really bad. And I think if anything that shows his perspective, his personality about all this, that he's not taking this too seriously, but he's enjoying.
It could even be a slight jab at like the Emperor crowd that's true. In their later stuff, it was like, oh my very technical. God, it was like Black Metal Rush kind of stuff. So but again, I think when we end with Earth's Last Picture and Too Old Too Cold, you're kind of getting a sense of
the linking of these sort of like the old era along with the kind of the sound that's kind of most representative of their new kind of stuff. And I mean, I think it's where Darkthrone's going to be for the future. I mean, I don't see them
going away anytime soon either.
And they're kind of doing their thing. I mean,
we got about a 2-foot stack of Darkthrone CDs here right now. So
and if I'm not mistaken, they've returned back to Peaceful.
They're back on Peaceful now.
Yeah.
And they've got actually like a sub-label that Fenriz is doing, like, Fenriz's top black metal, old school black metal. He's doing one of thrash apparently coming up too.
Cool.
So he's kind of got that cult of personality around him now too. So he's kind of bringing that in. But
so we hope that you have enjoyed hearing about Darkthrone, and let us know what you think. If you're new to Darkthrone, send us an email, requiempodcast@gmail.com. Comment. Let us know what you thought about all this, and if you hated it or loved it or want more,
or if your ears hurt, or if you're strangely compelled to listen to more.
Let us know.
What you think,
so enjoy Earth's Last Picture and Too Old, Too Cold. So for Jason Hundy
and Mark Rudolph,
this has been the Requiem Metal Podcast.
Whatever it is
This episode brought to you by Peaceful Records. Coming October 28th, Darkthrone, Dark Thrones and Black Flags, and Bloodbath, the Fathomless Mastery. Visit peacefulrecords.com for more information.